Hello and welcome to this episode of the Paranormalist Podcast. As always, I'm your co-host Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you this first Sunday in November, the first day of daylight saving time?
I'm doing just fine. It was a beautiful day. It was 58 degrees and sunny, and it was just a pretty day. The smell of fall was in the air, the feel of the warmth, which kind of reminds me of, you know, we're going to get to enjoy that a little longer before the winter falls upon us.
Well, my thought on there. Pennsylvania has 6 months of winter. If you got to turn on heat, it's winter. I'm sorry, it's just heating season, and it's not for me. And today I did cut my grass, hopefully for the last time this year, mulched up all the leaves, so the trees in my yard are now completely bald. So hopefully that's all taken care of. Uh, we would like to thank all of you for finding our podcast. If you're returning, thank you again for coming back. But if you're not subscribed, please do consider subscribing and liking. You'll find in the description links to our Facebook groups, our email address, and everything else Paranormalist Podcast related. And with that, there's all the commercial part. So I'll ask you, what's our topic for today?
Well, we're going to be visiting some interesting sites where there's haunting. So, um, as our listeners know, we did a little, not a raffle, but a little giveaway
Mhm.
of a book. And the young lady who won the book, you mentioned to me, and I had completely forgotten, so I do ask for her
Mhm.
pardon, that she wanted to hear some stories from the Ticonderoga area. So I started out with that, and then I kind of looped around and found some other stories that I thought kind of fit in nicely, and I thought I would tuck them all together and share. So the first place we're going is Fort Ticonderoga. And interestingly enough, the very first ghost story from Fort Ticonderoga actually starts in Scotland in the year of 1755. There's a gentleman by the name of Duncan Campbell, who was the lord of this particular um, area called the Cushation Hill area and in Inverness, and he was coming home from his day's work out, and he was a very well-to-do man, and he was coming home, and he sees this man running toward him up the side of a hill, and he's running at full speed. The man's clothes are raggedy. He's bleeding. He's got a gash on his head, and he's obviously terrified of something behind him because he keeps glancing backward. He runs up to this man, Duncan, and he begs Duncan, he's like, the avengers of my blood are on my track. Oh, save me. He was out of breath. He was panicked. He was in a lather. So feeling bad for this man and not knowing what the story was, so Duncan tells him, come, I know a way to help you. Um, by my word, as a member of my clan, I will, which has never failed a friend or foe yet, I will save you. And so he takes him to this area where there's a cave, and it's actually a big cave, but when the entrance to it's very, very tiny, and you have to sort of shinny through it. And he gets him inside there. He tells him there's water in this spring down here. I'll bring you food later. And he leaves him there. And when he gets back home, he's thinking he's done a good deed for somebody. But that night, he gets a visitor, and it's a family friend, and it's the actually a friend of his foster brothers, and his name is McNiven. And McNiven comes and he says, I have to talk to you. We've been looking for the man who murdered your foster brother, and we traced him not too far from here. We wounded him, but we lost him. If you see him come through here, don't give him any aid. And all the poor Duncan can think about is the fact that he had hidden a man in this cavern that very well could be that guy. And he's shocked. So he looks kind of stricken, and this fella thinks it's just McGiven thinks it's just because he's just found out his foster brother is dead. But in truth, it was because of the realization he very well might have helped his foster brother's murderer. And he and his foster brother were thick. They were very, very, very close. So after this guy leaves, he's kind of stuck in a quandary because he gave his word, and his word is etched in stone. It doesn't matter what all the circumstances are. In the moment he gave his word, he gave his word. So he has to see it through. So that night he gathers up a little bit of food and he takes it out and he takes it to the to this cavern, and he shinnies in and he gives him this little cloth bundle of food, and he asks some questions, and the guy very cautiously answers, says that he did kill somebody in a fight, and he wouldn't name the person, but he said something that struck fear in this man's heart, and that is that I understand his foster brother lives near here, not far from this, if I'm not mistaken. That was the confirmation. He goes home that night and he's sitting in his house. He's got a book and he's trying to read, and he's kind of in his head wrestling the whole thing. When out of the corner of his eye he sees a shadow enter the room, and it walks directly toward him. And when he looks up, it is the vestige of his foster brother. His blonde hair clotted with blood, his face is pale, his garments are soiled with the blood from the injury that killed him, and he says, Duncan, shield not the murderer, blood must flow for blood. And then he faded away. Despite all of this, Duncan had given his word, so the next day he goes out with more provisions, and that night his brother comes back to him again and he says, Duncan, shield not the murderer, blood must flow for blood. And that night, when Duncan goes out to the cavern, he takes food and he says to this man, I can shield you no longer. You must escape as best you can. And he hoped that this would appease his brother. But that night, as he's sitting in his chair, kind of waiting to see what would happen, his brother's shadow again falls upon him. And his brother states, I have warned you once, I have warned you twice. It is too late now. We shall meet again at Ticonderoga. Ticonderoga was a word he had never heard before. In fact, really nobody had ever heard it before. A couple years go by, and in 1756, the war between the French and the English, the French and Indian Wars, we know it in the Americas, happened, and Duncan becomes part of a group of soldiers who come to fight for the British. He is part of the 42nd Regiment, and he was put into port in New York in June. And he ends up becoming friends with Lieutenant Colonel by the name of Francis Grant. And that they become more than friends, comrades, serious comrades. And over time, he confides to not just his friend, but to other officers, the story of what had happened back in Scotland and the death of his foster brother. And some of them think it's crazy, and some of them think that it's, foolish. And he asks them, has any of you ever heard of a thing called the Ticonderoga? And they said, no, we haven't. You see, for the French, the fort was called St. Louis, but for the British, it was Fort Carillon. And nobody knew it by the name. The Native American name for the ground there was Ticonderoga, and nobody knew that name, not the British soldiers, nor the French. So they weren't lying. But on the 10th of July of that year, they were commanded to go to take back Fort Carillon. And as they were traveling, Francis, the friend of his, began to talk to others, and somewhere along the line he was talking to somebody who said, oh, you're headed up the Ticonderoga way. And he stopped and he said, what do you say? Where did you get that word? And he said, go away. He's like, you're from overseas, you wouldn't know. The locals, the native people, they call it Ticonderoga. And he looked at him like he had just been, slapped in the face, and he said, don't tell Duncan. Don't mention this to anyone else at all. And so they didn't. The battle starts, and as they're fighting, Duncan and his son, who came with him, were both mortally wounded. And as he is laying on the ground, Colonel Francis, the colonel, finds him and he tries to, help him, but he's mortally wounded. And Duncan looks up at him and he says, I heard somebody during the fighting say we were in Ticonderoga. Did you know this, my friend? And he said, yes, I only knew just today, and you lied to me. I didn't mean to, but I knew it would cause you fear. And now it's causing me death, and that of my son. And with that, Duncan died. The story has been passed down for literally well over 200 years and still talked about. And they say that the Highlander, Duncan, is still up there. He's seen on the ground where the fort is at, and he's still looking, waiting for something, perhaps angry at his friend for not telling him that he was going to his death. Perhaps he's still waiting for his foster brother, if he hadn't come to pick him up yet. But there's something that has kept him on that ground. And that is the first ghost story from Ticonderoga, long before anybody knew that it was even called Ticonderoga. Now, among the other ghosts that are supposed to haunt that area is one of my absolute favorites. And if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you've heard me talk about Mad Anthony Wayne.
I
Anthony
wondered
Wayne,
when his name would come up again.
of course.
Uh,
So you should know this. Anthony Wayne is literally a larger than life character who really was larger than life in his entire life. He was one of the most daring, um, rampacious human beings to ever live. He is really one of the reasons that George Washington lived and became our president. He rode all night in an ice storm at breakneck speed to warn Washington that he was going to walk into an ambush. And that's where he got the name Mad Anthony. Only a madman would race a horse through icy woods to try to catch somebody who was doomed and destined to walk into gunfire, but he caught him in the last second and he saved Washington. Not only that, but at one point, the General Wayne Inn, which is outside of Philadelphia, was actually named for him and for this event that I'm about to tell you. So Wayne and a lot of the founding fathers met at this inn. You have to understand, the men who pledged their life, their liberty, and their fortunes to the American Revolution became wanted men. They literally fled Philadelphia with their families and were in hiding, and they were really angry and upset because Washington had been a failure. The first half of the American Revolution, he lost a lot more battles than he won. And there was a lot of discord. And as they're meeting there to talk about all this, Anthony Wayne is there and they're saying, get rid of Washington. He's not a good general. He doesn't know what he's doing. He fights like the Brits. And we want somebody who can fight guerrilla warfare. And Anthony Wayne gave the most impassioned plea to hold your tongues and let Washington find his feet. And he stood up for Washington against all of these men. And he convinced them to let Washington go a little longer. And Washington did find his feet, and he did win the American Revolution. Wayne was a steadfast friend, even in the worst of times, to George Washington. So he was a good man. He was a crazy man in some things. He was a black drinker, meaning he would literally drink himself into blackouts. He could be nasty and mean and quarrelsome when he's drinking, and kind and nice when he's not. There are so many stories from Lake Erie all the way to Ticonderoga and all over the state of Pennsylvania from Anthony Wayne. One of the stories is that he haunts Ticonderoga's fort, that he's seen in the one room sitting near the fireplace smoking his pipe. Now, technically, he was never there. And by that I mean he was traveling and he kind of gave his own orders. It didn't matter what other people told him to do. He did what he wanted. So he most likely had been there on multiple occasions. We know that he was there at least a few times because one of the reasons he was coming to this area was a woman by the name of Nancy Coates. Nancy Coates was his mistress, and she was staying at the fort. She was a washerwoman working at the fort, and he came there to see her. So we know he had an affair with her. We know that she was there and that he came to meet her at different places she worked. Now, he was, by the way, also married and had children and what have you, but Wayne had more than one skirt at different places. So Nancy's only one of many, but she is seen running down a path from the fort toward Lake Champlain. So she was madly in love with Wayne. He was just this very amazing, handsome, debonair dude, and she had fallen head over heels. Now he decided to play a prank on her. He was asked to escort one of the general's daughters to Fort Ticonderoga. And so, as a joke on Nancy, he sends word ahead that he and his new mistress are arriving. And when she's told this by some of the advanced soldiers, she's devastated. And in tears, she takes off running and runs right into the lake and drowns herself. She didn't even wait for him to get there. And he never meant for that prank to play out the way it did. But she is still seen to this day. And people also say that sometimes they see a body of a woman floating on the water. And that when you try to go in to the water to rescue the person, she simply fades away. There is a ghost also of another woman by the name of Sarah Pell. And she is seen looking out of one of the upper windows of the barracks. There's also other soldiers seen up there, even though there are no soldiers in the barracks, of course. It's now pretty much a museum. And Sarah also is seen looking over what's now called the King's Garden from the window above the pavilion. Other people claim that they see red orbs floating throughout the fort. There are a great many stories. The stories of Mad Anthony Wayne are legion from all over the state. And well, we couldn't go to Ticonderoga and not talk about him. Now, there's lots of really interesting tales, and we're going to visit a couple other forts before this whole thing is over, but I wanted to move on to another story. When I was looking for this set of stories for Ticonderoga, I came across another interesting set of stories. Now, these are from Pennsylvania. They're from Center and Clinton counties. There's a gentleman by the name of John Lynn who wrote a group of folklore and legends down. And in amongst those things, I found some really interesting stories that I had never heard before, which is a bit of a surprise to me because I thought I knew most of Pennsylvania's ghostly tales. It was a point of pride. So let me tell you, I've been reading a lot in the last couple of days. Among them were these strange tales about different kinds of creatures and ghosts. So there are things called swamp angels, and I've heard of them before. I did not know we had one in Pennsylvania.
Oh,
But the
okay.
swamp angel, to give you some idea what a swamp angel is usually the death of a woman, an innocent death of a woman. And in this one from the Clinton County area, they talk of a young woman who was killed in the swamp, either by, and this is the most likely tale, supposedly she and her fiance or husband, depending on who's telling the tale, were captured by some escaped slaves So this area actually has a lot of stories about slaves who escaped from the South who settled in that region. And the story goes that she and her fiance or whatever he was were going through the area and they got caught up amongst these slaves in some way, and that in order to keep them silent, they killed them because they didn't want anybody to know they were there. So they killed her in the and took her body to the swamps and sunk her body in the swamps. And she supposedly appears as a ball of light rising up out of the swamp. And there are ways you can call her, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, but that she would reach out and help innocent people who came to her and asked specifically for her to help. Now, that might sound kind of crazy, but the story has lasted for well over 200 years. And there are swamp angel stories from other places. The story I encountered it with is another story that I'd like to share because they're going to come together. So, as I said, in the 1700s, late 1700s, and the early 1800s, there were communities of escaped slaves who, through the Underground Railroad, ended up in the area. And some of them stayed, and of course, others spread out to other places and continued on in their journey till they found wherever it is they wanted to live. Now, there was a couple, a married couple of Black people who came to this area and settled, and they gave birth to a son. His name was Isaac Gaines. And Isaac inherited his mother's knack for voodoo. That's what he had learned from his mother's hand. And through the years, he had become very popular amongst the local people as somebody you could go to. He became known as a witch hunter, and as a monster hunter and all of these different things. Now, Isaac, as I said, he was born early mid, late 1800s. And at some point, right before the American Civil War, they were beginning to ask for volunteers for the Union because everybody could see the handwriting on the walls. And a captain from a local militia rode out and asked Isaac if he wanted to join the military, and Isaac shot him dead. So I guess the answer is no. So, so now he's a draft dodger and a murderer. And he fled from his home and he lived in a couple other counties throughout most of the Civil War. And he lived under assumed names, but everybody local who had ever met him knew exactly who he was, but they kind of kept the story quiet. Now, Isaac had a reputation, as I said, for being a witch hunter, a ghost hunter, for laying monsters and things like that. And people would come and pay him to do it. Now I wanted to tell you a couple stories. There is the story of a woman by the name of Maud who got angry and cast a spell on a local woman who she didn't like. The woman was pregnant with her first child, and when the baby was delivered, of this other woman, her name was Liz, the baby was mutated, is the word they used. They said it looks like a half-grown monkey. And Maud took great pleasure in this, and Liz passed away. Now, Liz's people came to Isaac and they asked him to help to get Maud taken care of because obviously she was not a nice person. So he goes out and he goes into the swamp and he burns this plant he calls foxfire, and there is a plant called foxfire. And by the way, you can look at the census and see that Isaac really did exist. He was a real person, and all the characters in his stories really did exist. So through the census, we can at least document these people were all in the same time frame and living right where he says they were. And for 3 nights, he went out there with Liz's people and he burned the foxfire until on the 3rd night, the swamp angel came and he asked, how do we deal with this? And he was told by the swamp angel that one of her kin, one of this kin, needed to sleep for 3 nights in Ma's bed. So they made a pretense and got Maud away from the home, and for 3 nights they did. And when she returned the third night, well, on the third night, her ghost appeared at the foot of the bed, and after she appeared, Isaac stepped out of the darkness because he had been waiting. He said some incantations, and she was never seen again. Not alive, not dead. There are other stories of things that he did. He would end up dealing with a monster. Now, this is an area filled with a lot of German people, and the German people believed that they had brought with them certain beings, and one of the beings that they believed had come over upon the boats with them hidden were these werewolf-like creatures, if you will, called gilwoggles. Gilwoggles are a creature that can be conjured. It's not a real werewolf, but it is a beast that you can create, conjure up. And it has a bird's claws for its front hands. Its its legs are ended in horse hooves, and its body was that of a wolf. And it was conjured by witches in order to attack and destroy the farms of farmers that they didn't like for whatever the reason. And one of the things that Isaac was really good at was killing these beasts, laying them to rest. There are stories of him taking shotgun and shooting them, and they would burst into flame. There are other things such as potato people. I know that sounds crazy, but check this one out.
Okay.
There's the strange case of the impish potato people that terrorized a farmer named Philip Moyer, who made an amateur's mistake of insulting an old witch and denying her some of their famous spuds. This farmer was famous for the potatoes he grew. The woman turned out to be a witch, and these creatures that she conjured harassed Moyer until Isaac blew them away with a special triple barrel shotgun, and it is believed that he missed one of the potato people who is still out there to this day. So these are conjured demons, if you will. Then there's the story of John Roan. John Roan was a grumpy farmer, and he wasn't very well liked. But he had a beef with the crows in the area, and he would shoot at them all the time and not let them have any rest. Mysteriously, he disappeared. The last that anybody had seen of him, he was in amongst a murder of crows. If anybody doesn't know, that's what a flock of crows is called, a murder of crows, on his way home one night, and he was throwing rocks at them. And nobody ever saw him after that. So Isaac's wife hired him, John's wife hired Isaac to fetch John back from wherever the crows had taken him. So he asked for one of John's shoes, and he took it and he filled it with foxgloves, and he asked her for a bottle of her dandelion wine, which she was famous for. The first two ingredients he used to do battle with the crows to get John back, but he would later admit he had only asked for the wine because he liked it. Now, according to local records, John Roan did live. His wife's name was Belle, and he did disappear mysteriously. And a rotted corpse that could have been John's was eventually found, shoved into an old well in the area. But again, I can only tell you that the beings, that the people that were mentioned and many others have definitely got history to prove that they actually existed. And then just in case you think that's not strange enough, Clinton County has voted the werewolf creature that was conjured by the witches as their official county monster. I can't make this up, I
I
swear.
wonder how many counties have official county monsters.
I don't know. I had no clue that we had county monsters until this particular tale.
Huh.
I had no idea. If that's the case, there should be a monster for each county, I'm sure. Pennsylvania's loaded down with all kinds of cool stories. So, but I just thought it was fascinating, because all of the people actually did exist. It is rare that you come across folklore like that and you can literally pin down every person from the census. A lot of times there's just nothing to prove they ever were real. And yet Isaac was definitely real. He was the son of two escaped slaves who settled in Clinton County. And, his census records read farmer. Although a lot of the folklore of the area say he was a witch hunter and he laid ghosts and killed monsters. And if you had a problem, that's who you sought out. Now we're moving on to a couple other stories. One of the most interesting stories I know is the story of the Bishop White House down around Philadelphia. Now, it was built in 1787. It is the first dwelling for the consecrated bishop of the Episcopal Church in that region. He was a very well-to-do man. His dearest friend and also his servant, John, a young black man, and he became the best of friends. And John worked for him until John died of yellow fever. And he literally lived in an apartment above the carriage house. And he and the bishop would spend hours at night sitting, talking, discussing politics and things of the day. And there is definitely documentation that John did exist. John is seen to this day inside the house. When John died in the carriage house area, right after his death, he began to be seen inside the main house, the bishop's house. He would visit the bishop at night, and he was seen as a shadow figure walking along. He did not engender any fear, like when we talk about shadow people today. People who encountered John walking along the halls or in any of the rooms of the main house would describe it as a sad feeling. And he did not upset the bishop in any way. The bishop stayed in the house, had no problems, and stayed there until he died at the ripe old age of 87. Now, among the others that haunt the place is a lady by the name of Mrs. Boggs. Mrs. Boggs was a good friend of John's as well, and also the cook for the family. She and John were both well thought of. In fact, both of them would appear in letters from family members to other friends and family talking about, well, John and I are going to go do this, or Mrs. Boggs has made such an amazing dinner tonight, things like that. And they are talked about in multiple letters. So they were obviously part of the family as far as the bishop and his family were concerned. And Mrs. Boggs is still seen in the kitchen and on the first floor of the home. She actually had rooms above the kitchen, and for some reason she's never seen there. She's only seen on the first floor and the kitchen area. Now, the bishop himself, as I said, passed away in the house. He has been seen going down hallways, in his bedroom where he died, things like that. And he has been seen multiple times. And there is a sad-faced person. They don't know who it is, but he only appears on the third floor of the house, and he's always seen just looking out a window. And perhaps one of the strangest ghosts that haunts this house is Bishop White's ghost cat. Now, Bishop White had no cat. In fact, he had none at all. There was a doctor by the name of Dr. Rush who treated John when he had the yellow fever. And most likely he's the reason John didn't survive. because he gave everybody mercury and then bled them for every disease. That was his thing. Oh, we'll just give you some mercury and then bleed you. So he most likely poisoned John. But oddly enough, the doctor also traveled with his cat. And for some strange reason, after the cat died, Dr. Benjamin Rush's cat has been seen since its death at the bishop's house. He's seen in the window by people coming by the property. They hear a cat crying inside the house. There are no cats in the house, nor have there ever been. But people talk about hearing the ghost cat. Thought it was quite interesting. This house has a lot of history. It was a place where George Washington, John Adams, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson came to talk with the bishop and spend time. This house is considered one of the most historic properties. And I just thought it was a fascinating story. Now we're going to go on to a bit of a mystery. So this story takes place in Cowders Point, Pennsylvania. Cowders Point is, it's just a little town. And there lived in that town in the 1960s an old man by the name of Dr. John Irving Bentley. Dr. Bentley was a 92-year-old retired physician. In December of 1966, he didn't answer the door when the gas man came to deliver his bill. So the gentleman from the gas company, Don Gosnell, knocked upon the door multiple times, was a bit surprised because the doctor, for his age, was very sprightly and walked with a walker, but he definitely would always answer the door. And when he didn't answer after quite a while, Mr. Gosnell decided he should probably open the door and check on the old man. It bothered him. So he opened the door quietly and he noticed a funny smell and a light blue smoke coming from the basement. He investigated and found that there was a hole in the bathroom floor burned through, and a bathtub, had a burnt bathrobe in it, as though something had caught fire. The walker was tilted against the tub, and a pile of ashes with only a single leg and a slipper was sitting beside the tub. The rubber tips of the walker did not melt. The paint from the tub was not blackened or blistered. And yet, the remains of the doctor was found in the basement, badly burnt, almost completely incinerated. Of course, the police were called, the coroner shows, and the official version of the story is that Deputy Coroner John Deck decided that Dr. Bentley fell asleep while smoking his pipe, which toppled upon his bathrobe. He went to the bathroom to put it out, took it off, but his other clothes had ignited and they burned through the floor without him being able to get out of them. A lot of people do not believe this story. First of all, in order to incinerate a person, it has to be over 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is one of the most famous cases of spontaneous human combustion to ever be recorded. I actually knew a guy by the name of Larry Arnold, who is an expert in this field. He has worked with fire departments for 50 years checking these cases. This was one of the cases that he did check, and he talked about it. This is also the case where they came up with the thing called the wick theory, meaning that the human body fat could act like a candle wick. And, there is no evidence of what really happened. And yet, that story stands as one of the most convincing cases of spontaneous human combustion to this day. It is a topic which I have to tell you I've read about over and over, and I'm still fascinated with. And now we're going to go on to visit a couple other places. For those of you who've never heard of it, there is a place called Pittston Township in northeastern Pennsylvania. In that township, there's a place called the Susquehanna Road. Susquehanna Road It's just a regular old highway runs. It's not particularly large. It's not got anything great about it except for this. It is the road that is noted in the area for being the site of the Sisquan Screamer. Let me explain. The story goes that there was a young woman who had gotten married at the church down the road a ways that afternoon. And at the reception at the church, it was discovered that her beloved, who she had just married, was also having an affair with somebody else. And devastated, she had pelted out of the church, still in her wedding gown, and had taken off brokenhearted. The story is that tear-stained, face, she just took off blindly running down the highway. Now, at some point, she realizes it's getting dark and she's not sure where she's at. And so she starts looking to see if there's maybe a car nearby or somebody that could, stop and pick her up. Now, hitchhiking it was a tradition in many areas. And so she didn't think much of it. And she was hitchhiking, trying to get a ride to get back to town. And this big old blue car pulls up. And the guy sticks his head out and he says, "Do you need a ride?" And she says, "Yes, please." So she gets into the car, and as they're driving along, she sees this bridge above where they're headed, and she says to the man, "Don't let me out before you cross the bridge." And he's like, "Are you sure?" She says, "Yes, yes." And she seems deadly calm now. She's like, "I'm good. I'm fine." And he's like, "I don't know. I'd be happy to take you into town." She's like, "No, no, no, it's okay. I'm good." And he's like, "Oh, okay." So he pulls off before he gets to the bridge, and she gets out, and he pulls back out, and he's like, "Are you sure?" She's like, "Yeah, I'm sure. I'm okay now. I don't live too far from here. I'll just walk." He's like, "All right, but I'd take you there." "No, it's okay." And he pulls off the bridge. When he gets into town, he hears about this, crazy wedding that with the mistress like coming in at the tail end of everything and blowing it all up, and this girl, and he's like, "That's the girl. That has to be the girl with the white dress that I saw and I picked up." Well, what he didn't know is she jumped off the bridge that night and ended her own life. And since then, the Susquehanna Screamer has begun to scream. Travelers on the road talk about seeing a figure in a tattered wedding gown flapping, passing cars and trying to wave them down. And if they stop to offer her a ride, there's a chill in the air and a sense of unease that makes them want to pull out. And at the very last second, if they wait long enough, she'll reach for the car door and vanish. But that's nothing compared to what happens if you come across her late at night. The woods right before the bridge come alive with the earth-shattering screams of a woman in mortal agony, her heartbreak bellowing as she screams as she jumps off the bridge. You don't see her, but there's no way you cannot hear her. And she has been heard ever since her death. And she's now called the Susquehanna Road Screamer. Now I'd like to take you to one last fort, and then off we go. So I live not far from Frederick, Maryland, and I am fascinated with forts. In fact, the Fort Bedford, which is nearby me and a place that's near and dear to my heart, a lot of its impact actually comes from Fort Frederick. So the people of Fort Frederick, some of them came to this area and settled, and literally Bedford was part of Maryland at that time frame. And so there's a lot of shared history, and a lot of the design of the forts were very similar. This is called a star fort. It's different. It's the shape of a fort. And look at it. It looks like a star shape. And that was really common during the American Revolution. The This fort was built in 1750s. It was a defensive fort, and there was a lot of conflict and suffering that went on there. It was far more active than Fort Bedford for the time frame, and was even used during the Civil War. It saw shots fired in anger when Confederate troops fired at its walls as they came up through Maryland and headed toward Gettysburg. There are so many stories of reenactors who go there to work who report feeling hostile feelings from the front right bastion of the fort. Some describe feeling like they're being followed out of the area. Interestingly, people portraying the Scottish regiments that were also at the fort tell a completely different story of feeling welcomed and comforted, and that everything's very peaceful and friendly in that very same bastion. The Scottish regiments there surrendered at Yorktown in 1781, but this would have definitely been their home base. Visitors talk about seeing apparitions such as soldiers in uniform walking through the visitor center, a young man in khaki clothing suddenly disappearing near the parking lot, and there was civilian conservation corps activity there, and they believe that this man is probably from the most recent vintage, being the 1930s and 40s, and he was a civilian conservation corps worker. There are so many stories of people moving through the fort that they are thought to be reenactors, even when there are no reenactors there. And if you get a chance to check it out, well, I highly recommend it. It's fascinating. By the way, they found a completely intact set of tunnels through the fort that were used for moving troops, for moving goods that they didn't want anybody to see. There's all kinds of uses that this actually was used for, and they renovated them, and you can now go through them.
Wow.
I know, like Ben, my son Ben and I are like, that's our first thing come spring. I have waited a while. I want to go see them. So if you get a chance, go check it out. If you live anywhere nearby or you find yourself in that area, please to do so. And then I'm going to leave you with one last poignant story for this night. Joseph Bonaparte, who was Napoleon Bonaparte's brother, came to the United States and settled in Pennsylvania. People don't talk about it much, but he settled outside of Bristol in the eastern part of Pennsylvania, and he had a barge, a French barge, that he would use to travel the river. And in that time frame, a lot of people traveled the river rather than the highways. It was safer and a more direct route, and water travel was very popular. And he would travel on his barge to visit Mr. Keene, who owned a mansion called the Keene Mansion in Bristol, and ostensibly to also see Mr. Keene's daughter, Sarah. Sarah Keene was beautiful, much younger than Joseph, and they struck up a friendship. But Joseph fell madly in love with her. And unfortunately for him, Sarah did not fall in love with him. But he would come all the time with torches lighting his way as they moved the barge. He would put in at the little dock, and he would go up, he would have supper, he would talk, enjoy the evening. On more than one occasion, he tried to ask Sarah if she would consider being his wife, and always she told him, "You're a good friend. Good night." And then he would get on the barge and he would move again back to his own home. After he passed away, even to this day, people claim that they see the barge moving, working its way back toward the Keene Mansion. The mansion's not there any longer. It's now the Grundy Memorial Library that stands on that site. They say on certain summer nights, you'll see the lights of the barge moving as it puts into the little dock that's no longer there. And Joseph, apparently he's still trying to court Sarah, even from beyond the dead. And with that, I wish you all a good night.